Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a busy OPD morning at Panacea Hospital, Varanasi. A 56-year-old gentleman walks in. He is a familiar face. Long-standing type 2 diabetes, borderline kidney function, a little breathless on exertion, sometimes complaining of palpitations in the chest at night. His ECG last year was almost normal. Today, the strip in your hand shows a few premature beats, a slightly stretched QT, maybe a hint of left atrial enlargement. Nothing spectacular. But behind that apparently simple tracing, an entire hidden universe is unfolding inside his cardiomyocytes. This is the universe of the cardio-kidney metabolic continuum. Chapter 1. When sugar enters the heart, think of every heartbeat as a well-rehearsed orchestra performance. Ion channels are the musicians, calcium is the conductor's baton, mitochondria are the power plant lighting up the stage, and gap junctions are the microphones and speakers connecting section to section. In diabetes, the first insult is silent glucose quietly slipping inside these heart cells, sticking to proteins, forming advanced glycation end products. The blood looks innocent, but the tissues are slowly caramelizing. Proteins that were born to be flexible and responsive become stiff, cross-linked, and irritable. The mitochondria feel this first. They are overfed, undressed, and begin to leak sparks, reactive oxygen species instead of clean, efficient energy. Those sparks start a fire. ROS nibble at ion channels, oxidize ReR2 on the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and disturb the very clockwork of calcium cycling. Where once calcium entered and exited in a crisp, rhythmic pattern, now there are leaks, dribbles, and sudden uncontrolled bursts. You can almost hear the cardiomyocyte whisper, "I am tired, I am overloaded, and I am losing my rhythm." This is how the groundwork for atrial fibrillation and ventricular arrhythmias is laid, long before the first episode ever appears on a monitor. Chapter 2. The atrium. From chamber to storm. Now zoom into the left atrium. It used to be a smooth, elastic chamber like a soft balloon, expanding and contracting with each pulmonary venous flow. In our diabetic patient, that balloon is slowly becoming a scarred, stiff bag. High blood pressure stretches it from outside. Obesity pushes from above. Sleep apnea hammers it at night. And diabetes poisons it from within. Inside each atrial myocyte, ReR2 has become leaky. Calcium that should stay neatly packed inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum escapes in tiny sparks during diastole. These sparks coalesce into waves, and every wave nudges the membrane saying, "Fire a beat, fire a beat." When enough of them occur together, a premature atrial contraction emerges, a PVC's atrial cousin. At the same time, circuit 2A, the pump that should sweep calcium back into the storehouse, is underperforming. The cell gets stuck with calcium in all the wrong places and at all the wrong times. The action potential shortens here, prolongs there. Repolarization becomes patchy, like a road with some freshly tarred segments and some full of potholes. Meanwhile, the NLRP3 inflammasome wakes up. Picture it as a tiny molecular tribunal in the cell, receiving constant complaints. Glucose is high, ROS are too many, lipids are overflowing. Finally, it slams the gavel. Inflammation. Caspase 1 is activated, IL-1 beta and IL-18 are released, and the entire atrial neighborhood begins to burn with low-grade chronic inflammation. Fibroblasts, which once quietly maintained the connective tissue architecture, receive the alarm. They transform into angry myofibroblasts, start laying down collagen with a vengeance. Those uniform atrial pathways that once allowed smooth conduction become a maze. Wave fronts of depolarization are forced to zigzag, slow down, take detours. Every detour is a potential re-entry circuit. Add to this the misbehaving gap junctions. Connexin 43 and connexin 40 are shuffled from their proper positions at the intercalated discs and misexpressed along the lateral borders. Imagine a crowd where half the walkie-talkies are suddenly tuned to the wrong frequency. Conduction becomes inconsistent, sometimes too fast, sometimes blocked. Then one day, after perhaps a heavy dinner or a sleepless night, a premature atrial beat fires at exactly the wrong place and the wrong time. It encounters a patchwork of slow and fast conduction, of excitable and refractory tissue. Instead of dying out, it swirls, curls, splits, and the atrium dissolves into fibrillatory chaos. We call it atrial fibrillation. But the true story began years earlier, inside the mitochondria and the calcium stores of a diabetic atrial cell. Chapter 3: The ventricle's long QT and short fuse. Shift your focus now to the ventricle. This chamber has a different temperament. It is powerful, muscular, built to generate pressure. Its action potentials are broader, its repolarization more complex. Here the price of disturbance is higher. When things go wrong, they go catastrophically wrong. In diabetes and CKD, several subtle but deadly changes accumulate. First, the potassium channels that should rapidly repolarize the cell, especially the hERG channel, begin to underperform. Their expression drops, their kinetics are altered. Repolarization slows, the action potential stretches. Meanwhile, persistent sodium current through NAV1. 5 adds a persistent inward trickle of charge during the plateau. Type calcium channels linger open a little longer, letting in more calcium than the cell can comfortably handle. The result is a QT interval that creeps from normal to borderline, from borderline to frankly prolonged. On the surface ECG we see milliseconds. Inside the cell we see a prolonged plateau where calcium and sodium currents refuse to switch off. Now bring the kidney into the story. In CKD, potassium handling becomes treacherous. Hyperkalemia may hover just at the upper end of normal, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to twist resting membrane potentials and alter conduction. At another time, a diuretic or diarrheal episode pulls potassium and magnesium down, removing 2 important stabilizers of repolarization. Hypomagnesemia in particular is like taking the shock absorbers of a racing car. The ride becomes dangerously bouncy. On top of this, uremic toxins such as adenine derivatives, FGF23, phosphate excess infiltrate the myocardium. Over months and years, they persuade the ventricle to hypertrophy and fibrose. Wall thickness increases, compliance decreases, and islands of fibrosis appear like boulders in a flowing stream. Conduction must now navigate around these barriers, setting up zones of delay and potential block. In this fragile environment, a prolonged action potential becomes a loaded gun. During that extended plateau, early after depolarizations can form, small upward blips as calcium channels reopen or sodium currents reignite unexpectedly. If one of those EADs reaches threshold, it becomes a premature ventricular complex. If enough myocytes do this together, a run of torsade de pointes or polymorphic VT erupts. The patient may experience palpitations, dizziness, or simply collapse. Later, when fibrosis is advanced, monomorphic VT can circle around scars in a stable, vicious loop. What began as a metabolic disturbance has matured into a structural arrhythmic substrate. Chapter 4: The Silent Puppeteer. Autonomic neuropathy in the background of all this cellular drama. Another player is quietly pulling the strings, the autonomic nervous system. Diabetic autonomic neuropathy is a paradox. The heart is simultaneously overdriven and underprotected. Sympathetic activity predominates, parasympathetic tone fades. The resting heart rate climbs a little. Heart rate variability flattens. Nighttime dipping of blood pressure disappears. This autonomy gone wrong does 2 dangerous things. First, chronic sympathetic drive bathes the heart in catecholamines. Adrenergic receptors, when repeatedly stimulated, increase calcium influx and SR load. A full SR is an irritable SR. Any small trigger can provoke a leak, a wave, and after depolarization. Second, the loss of vagal restraint removes a natural antiarrhythmic shield. The vagus is like a wise elder in the village council, slowing everyone down, preventing impulsive decisions. When that elder is silenced, even minor provocations escalate into full-blown arrhythmic storms. This is why a patient who seems stable on paper may suddenly present with nocturnal VT, why QT prolongation in a diabetic with autonomic neuropathy is far more ominous than the same QT in someone else. Chapter 5: The Cardio-Kidney Metabolic Triangle. Now, knit the story together. On one corner of the triangle stands the heart, dealing with hypertrophy, fibrosis, calcium mishandling, and ion channel remodeling. On the second corner sits the kidney, struggling with declining GFR, fluid overload, electrolyte imbalance, and uremic toxins. On the third corner is the metabolic engine, obesity, insulin resistance, dyslipidemia, and systemic inflammation. Signals travel continuously between these three corners. When the kidney fails, RAS activation surges, sodium and water retention increase, blood pressure rises. The heart is forced to hypertrophy and dilate. Wall stress fuels further fibrosis and arrhythmias. Meanwhile, uremic toxins flow back to the heart and vasculature, worsening oxidative stress. When the metabolic corner flares, uncontrolled diabetes, weight gain, inflammation, the kidney's microvasculature is injured, albumin leaks, GFR slides. The heart in turn receives a flood of free fatty acids, ROS, and inflammatory mediators that worsen diastolic dysfunction and atrial enlargement. And when the heart decompensates, HFpEF or HFrEF, renal perfusion falls, venous congestion rises, and metabolic homeostasis becomes almost impossible. Arrhythmias are not isolated events in this triangle. Atrial fibrillation is often the first visible crack, appearing when atrial stretch, fibrosis, and inflammation cross a threshold. Ventricular arrhythmias and conduction blocks emerge later, when the ventricle is structurally and electrically exhausted. Every time the ECG printer rolls out a strip of AF or VT in a CK diabetic patient, it is telling us the entire triangle is unstable. Chapter 6, Rewriting the Ending. Therapeutic storytelling. The good news is that this story is not fixed. We can change its trajectory, sometimes quite dramatically. Imagine going back in time for our 56-year-old patient. Years earlier, when his HbA1c began to creep up, we could have added an SGLT2 inhibitor. At first glance, it looks like a glucose-lowering pill, but inside his organs it would have done far more, easing intraglomerular pressure, slowing nephron loss, gently decongesting the heart, improving cardiac energetics. The atrial stretch would have been less, the ventricular wall less heavy, the kidney under less siege. Alongside, a GLP-1 receptor agonist could have helped him lose weight, reduce visceral and epicardial fat, and dampen systemic inflammation. The mitochondrial overload would have eased, ROS production dropped, the NLRP3 inflammasome remained drowsy instead of hyperactive. Early, judicious use of a mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist would have told fibroblasts to calm down. Less collagen, fewer scars, smoother conduction. The stage for re-entry circuits would have been less elaborate. Control of blood pressure, statins for dyslipidemia, ACE inhibitors or ARBs for RAS blockade. Each of these would have chipped away at one piece of the arrhythmic substrate. It is like reinforcing a house being slowly undermined from three sides. Every beam, every pillar we repair makes torsion and collapse less likely. Of course, classical antiarrhythmic tools still have their place. Beta blockers to blunt sympathetic excess. Amiodarone, when needed to stabilize membranes without adding significant proarrhythmic risk in structural disease. Catheter ablation to cauterize the hot spots of AF or VT reentry. Pacemakers and ICDs as guardians ready to rescue the patient from bradycardia or sudden death. But the real magic happens when these are layered on top of upstream CKM optimization. Chapter 7, Returning to the Clinic. Let us come back to our patient in Panacea OPD. You look at his ECG with fresh eyes. The slight QT stretch, those scattered premature beats, the subtle left atrial enlargement, they are no longer minor abnormalities. They are the visible tip of a deep, invisible iceberg. You talk to him about more than just sugar. You discuss kidney protection, blood pressure, weight, sleep, adherence. You check his electrolytes, his medications, his autonomic symptoms, postural giddiness, resting tachycardia, lack of heart rate variability. You consider whether an SGLT2 inhibitor or GLP-1RA should be introduced or optimized. You review his RAS blockade, his mineralocorticoid use, his diuretic doses. If he already has AF, you decide not only on rate versus rhythm control, but also on stroke prevention, underlying triggers, and structural remodeling strategies. If he has frequent PVCs or runs of NSVT, you weigh the possibility of occult ischemia, LV dysfunction, or scar. Perhaps an echocardiogram, a Holter, or a cardiac MRI is needed, not as academic exercises, but as windows into his evolving CKM heart. By the end of the consultation, he is no longer just a diabetic with some ectopics. He is a complex but understandable story in progress, and you have multiple levers to gently rewrite the following chapters. Epilogue. Hearing the hidden rhythm. If this were an audiobook, I would end with a sound. Not the alarming tone of VT, not the chaotic rustle of AF, but a steady, confident sinus rhythm, lub-dub, beating inside a heart that is understood, protected, and respected. Every patient with diabetes and CKD carries both possibilities inside their chest, the calm sinus song and the storm of arrhythmia. Our role as clinicians and as thinkers in the CKM era is to recognize which way the story is leaning and to pull early and consistently toward the safer rhythm. Because in the cardio-kidney metabolic continuum, arrhythmias are not random accidents. They are the final chapters of a long, complex narrative. If we listen carefully enough, we can hear the plot twists years before the climax, and we can change how the story ends.